Robert Louis Stevenson, Crabbed Age and Youth. Narrated by Carl Mason. You know my mother now and then argues very notably, always very warmly at least. I happen often to differ from her, and we both think so well of our own arguments that we very seldom are so happy as to convince one another. A pretty common case, I believe, in all vehement debatings. She says I am too witty, Angler say too pert. I, that she is too wise, that is to say, being likewise put into English, not so young as she has been. Miss Howe to Miss Harlowe. Clarissa, Volume 2, Letter 13. There is a strong feeling in favour of cowardly and prudential proverbs. The sentiments of a man, while he is full of ardour and hope, are to be received, it is supposed, with some qualification. But when the same person has ignominiously failed and begins to eat up his words, he should be listened to like an oracle. Most of our pocket wisdom is conceived for the use of mediocre people, to discourage them from ambitious attempts and generally console them in their mediocrity. And since mediocre people constitute the bulk of humanity, this is no doubt very properly so. But it does not follow that the one sort of proposition is any less true than the other, or that Icarus is not to be more praised and perhaps more envied than Mr. Samuel Budget, the successful merchant. The one is dead, to be sure, while the other is still in his counting house, counting out his money, and doubtless this is a consideration. But we have, on the other hand, some bold and magnanimous sayings, common to high races and natures, which set forth the advantage of the losing side, and proclaim it better to be a dead lion than a living dog. It is difficult to fancy how the mediocrities reconcile such sayings with their proverbs. According to the latter, every lad who goes to sea is an egregious ass. Never to forget your umbrella through a long life would seem a higher and wiser flight of achievement than to go smiling to the stake. And so long as you are a bit of a coward and inflexible in money matters, you fulfill the whole duty of man. It is a still more difficult consideration for our average men that while all their teachers, from Solomon down to Benjamin Franklin and the ungodly Binney, have inculcated the same ideal of manners, caution, and respectability, those characters in history who have most notoriously flown in the face of such precepts are spoken of in hyperbolic terms of praise and honoured with public monuments in the streets of our commercial centres. This is very bewildering to the moral sense. You have Joan of Arc, who left a humble but honest and reputable livelihood under the eyes of her parents, to go a colonialing in the company of rowdy soldiers against the enemies of France. Surely a melancholy example for one's daughters. And then you have Columbus, who may have pioneered America, but, when all is said, was a most imprudent navigator. His life is not the kind of thing one would like to put into the hands of young people. Rather, one would do one's utmost to keep it from their knowledge, as a red flag of adventure and disintegrating influence in life. The time would fail me if I were to recite all the big names in history whose exploits are perfectly irrational and even shocking to the business mind. The incongruity is speaking, and I imagine it must engender among the mediocrities a very peculiar attitude towards the nobler and showier sides of national life. They will read of the charge of Balaclava in much the same spirit as they assist at a performance of the Lion's Mail. Persons of substance take in the Times and sit composedly in pit or boxes according to the degree of their prosperity in business. As for the generals who go galloping up and down among bombshells in absurd cocked hats, as for the actors who rattle their faces and demean themselves for hire upon the stage, they must belong, thank God, to a different order of beings, whom we watch as we watch the clouds careering in the windy, bottomless, inane, or read about like characters in ancient and rather fabulous annals. Our offspring would no more think of copying their behavior, let us hope, than of doffing their clothes and painting themselves blue in consequence of certain admissions in the first chapter of their school history of England. Discredited as they are in practice, the cowardly proverbs hold their own in theory, and it is another instance of the same spirit that the opinions of old men about life have been accepted as final. All sorts of allowances are made for the illusions of youth, and none, or almost none, for the disenchantments of age. It is held to be a good taunt, and somehow or other to clinch the question logically, when an old gentleman waggles his head and says, "Ah, so I thought when I was your age." It is not thought an answer at all if the young man retorts, "My venerable sir, so I shall most probably think when I am yours." And yet the one is as good as the other, pass for pass, tit for tat, a Roland for an Oliver. Opinion in good men, says Milton, is but knowledge in the making. All opinions, properly so called, are stages on the road to truth. It does not follow that a man will travel any further, but if he has really considered the world and drawn a conclusion, he has traveled as far. This does not apply to formulae got by rote, which are stages on the road to nowhere but second childhood and the grave. To have a catchword in your mouth is not the same thing as to hold an opinion. Still less is it the same thing as to have made one for yourself. There are too many of these catchwords in the world for people to rap out upon you like an oath and by way of an argument. They have a currency as intellectual counters, and many respectable persons pay their way with nothing else. They seem to stand for vague bodies of theory in the background. The imputed virtue of folios full of knockdown arguments is supposed to reside in them, just as some of the majesty of the British Empire dwells in the constable's truncheon. They are used in pure superstition, as old clodhoppers spoil Latin by way of an exorcism, and yet they are vastly serviceable for checking unprofitable discussion and stopping the mouths of babes and sucklings. And when a young man comes to a certain stage of intellectual growth, the examination of these counters forms a gymnastic at once amusing and fortifying to the mind. Because I have reached Paris, I am not ashamed of having passed through New Haven and Dieppe. They were very good places to pass through, and I am none the less at my destination. All my old opinions were only stages on the way to the one I now hold, as itself is only a stage on the way to something else. I am no more abashed at having been a red-hot socialist with a panacea of my own than at having been a sucking infant. Doubtless the world is quite right in a million ways, but you have to be kicked about a little to convince you of the fact. And in the meanwhile, you must do something, be something, believe something. It is not possible to keep the mind in a state of accurate balance and blank. And even if you could do so, instead of coming ultimately to the right conclusion, you would be very apt to remain in a state of balance and blank to perpetuity. Even in quite intermediate stages, a dash of enthusiasm is not a thing to be ashamed of in the retrospect. If St. Paul had not been a very zealous Pharisee, he would have been a colder Christian. For my part, I look back at the time when I was a socialist with something like regret. I have convinced myself, for the moment, that we had better leave these great changes to what we call great blind forces, their blindness being so much more perspicacious than the little, peering, partial eyesight of men. I seemed to see that my own scheme would not answer, and all the other schemes I ever heard propounded would depress some elements of goodness just as much as they encouraged others. Now I know that in thus turning conservative with years, I am going through the normal cycle of change and traveling in the common orbit of men's opinions. I submit to this, as I would submit to gout or grey hair, as a concomitant of growing age or else of failing animal heat. but I do not acknowledge that it is necessarily a change for the better. I dare say it is deplorably for the worse. I have no choice in the business, and can no more resist this tendency of my mind than I could prevent my body from beginning to totter and decay. If I am spared, as the phrase runs, I shall doubtless outlive some troublesome desires, but I am in no hurry about that, nor, when the time comes, shall I plume myself on the immunity. Just in the same way, I do not greatly pride myself on having outlived my belief in the fairy tales of socialism. Old people have faults of their own. They tend to become cowardly, niggardly, and suspicious. Whether from the growth of experience or the decline of animal heat, I see that age leads to these and certain other faults, and it follows, of course, that while in one sense I hope I am journeying towards the truth, in another I am indubitably posting towards these forms and sources of error. As we go catching at this or that corner of knowledge, now getting a foresight of generous possibilities, now chilled with a glimpse of prudence, we may compare the headlong course of our years to a swift torrent in which a man is carried away. Now he is dashed against a boulder. Now he grapples for a moment to a trailing spray. At the end, he is hurled out and overwhelmed in a dark and bottomless ocean. We have no more than glimpses and touches. We are torn away from our theories. We are spun round and shown this or the other view of life, until only fools or knaves can hold to their opinions. We take a sight as a condition in life, and say we have studied it. Our most elaborate view is no more than an impression. If we had breathing space, we should take the occasion to modify and adjust. But at this breakneck hurry, we are no sooner boys than we are adult, no sooner in love than married or jilted, no sooner one age than we begin to be another, and no sooner in the fullness of our manhood than we begin to decline towards the grave. It is in vain to seek for consistency or expect clear and stable views in a medium so perturbed and fleeting. This is no cabinet science in which things are tested to a scruple. We theorize with a pistol to our head. We are confronted with a new set of conditions on which we have not only to pass a judgment, but to take action before the hour is at an end. And we cannot even regard ourselves as a constant in this flux of things. Our identity itself seems in a perpetual variation, and not infrequently we find our own disguise the strangest in the masquerade. In the course of time, we grow to love things we hated and hate things we loved. Milton is not so dull as he once was, nor perhaps Ainsworth so amusing. It is decidedly harder to climb trees and not nearly so hard to sit still. There is no use pretending. Even the thrice royal game of hide and seek has somehow lost in zest. All our attributes are modified or changed, and it will be a poor account of us if our views do not modify and change in a proportion. To hold the same views at 40 as we held at 20 is to have been stupefied for a score of years and take rank not as a prophet, but as an unteachable brat, well birched and none the wiser. It is as if a ship captain should sail to India from the port of London, and having brought a chart of the Thames on deck at his first setting out, should obstinately use no other for the whole voyage. And mark you, it would be no less foolish to begin at Gravesend with a chart of the Red Sea. Si jeunesse savait, si vieillesse pouvait, is a very pretty sentiment, but not necessarily right. In 5 cases out of 10, it is not so much that the young people do not know as that they do not choose. There is something irreverent in the speculation, but perhaps the want of power has more to do with the wise resolutions of age than we are always willing to admit. It would be an instructive experiment to make an old man young again and leave him all his savoir. I scarcely think he would put his money in the savings bank after all. I doubt if he would be such an admirable son as we are led to expect. And as for his conduct in love, I believe firmly he would out-Herod Herod and put the whole of his new compeers to the blush. Prudence is a wooden juggernaut, before whom Benjamin Franklin walks with the poorly ear of a high priest, and after whom dances many a successful merchant in the character of Atis. But it is not a deity to cultivate in youth. If a man lives to any considerable age, it cannot be denied that he laments his imprudences, but I notice he often laments his youth a deal more bitterly and with a more genuine intonation. It is customary to say that age should be considered, because it comes last. It seems just as much to the point that youth comes first. And the scale fairly kicks the beam if you go on to add that age, in a majority of cases, never comes at all. Disease and accident make short work of even the most prosperous persons. Death costs nothing, and the expense of a headstone is an inconsiderable trifle to the happy heir. To be suddenly snuffed out in the middle of ambitious schemes is tragical enough at best. But when a man has been grudging himself his own life in the meanwhile, and saving up everything for the festival that was never to be, it becomes that hysterically moving sort of tragedy which lies on the confines of farce. The victim is dead, and he has cunningly overreached himself, a combination of calamities none the less absurd for being grim. The husband, a favourite claret until the batch turns sour, is not at all an artful stroke of policy, and how much more with a whole cellar, a whole bodily existence. People may lay down their lives with cheerfulness in the sure expectation of a blessed immortality. But that is a different affair from giving up youth with all its admirable pleasures, in the hope of a better quality of gruel in a more than problematic, nay, more than improbable old age. We should not compliment a hungry man, who should refuse a whole dinner and reserve all his appetite for the dessert before he knew whether there was to be any dessert or not. If there be such a thing as imprudence in the world, we surely have it here. We sail in leaky bottoms and on great and perilous waters. And to take a cue from the dolorous old naval ballad, we have heard the mermaidens singing, and know that we shall never see dry land any more. Old and young, we are all on our last cruise. If there is a fill of tobacco among the crew, for God's sake, pass it round, and let us have a pipe before we go. Indeed, by the report of our elders, this nervous preparation for old age is only trouble thrown away. We fall on guard, and after all it is a friend who comes to meet us. After the sun is down and the west faded, the heavens begin to fill with shining stars. So as we grow old, a sort of equable jog-trot of feeling is substituted for the violent ups and downs of passion and disgust. The same influence that restrains our hopes quiets our apprehensions. If the pleasures are less intense, the troubles are milder and more tolerable, and, in a word, this period for which we are asked to hoard up everything as for a time of famine is, in its own right, the richest, easiest, and happiest of life. Nay, by managing its own work and following its own happy inspiration, youth is doing the best it can to endow the leisure of age. A full, busy youth is your only prelude to a self-contained and independent age, and the muff inevitably develops into the bore. There are not many Dr. Johnsons to set forth upon their first romantic voyage at 64. If we wish to scale Mont Blanc or visit a thieves' kitchen in the East End, to go down in a diving dress or up in a balloon, we must be about it while we are still young. It will not do to delay until we are clogged with prudence and limping with rheumatism, and people begin to ask us, "What does gravity out of bed?" Youth is the time to go flashing from one end of the world to the other, both in mind and body, to try the manners of different nations, to hear the chimes at midnight, to see sunrise in town and country, to be converted at a revival, to circumnavigate the metaphysics, write halting verses, run a mile to see a fire, and wait all day long in the theatre to applaud Hernani. There is some meaning in the old theory about wild oats, and a man who has not had his green sickness and got done with it for good is as little to be depended on as an unvaccinated infant. It is extraordinary, says Lord Beaconsfield, one of the brightest and best preserved of youths up to the date of his last novel. It is extraordinary how hourly and how violently change the feelings of an inexperienced young man. And this mobility is a special talent entrusted to his care, a sort of indestructible virginity, a magic armor with which he can pass unhurt through great dangers and come unbedaubed out of the mirest passages. Let him voyage, speculate, see all that he can, do all that he may. His soul has as many lives as a cat. He will live in all weathers and never be a halfpenny the worse. Those who go to the devil in youth with anything like a fair chance were probably little worth saving from the first. They must have been feeble fellows, creatures made of putty and packthread, without steel or fire, anger or true joyfulness in their composition. We may sympathize with their parents, but there is not much cause to go into mourning for themselves. For to be quite honest, the weak brother is the worst of mankind. When the old man waggles his head and says, "Ah, so I thought when I was your age," he has proved the youth's case, doubtless whether from growth of experience or decline of animal heat. He thinks so no longer, but he thought so while he was young, and all men have thought so while they were young, since there was dew in the morning, or hawthorn in May. And here is another young man adding his vote to those of previous generations and riveting another link to the chain of testimony. It is as natural and as right for a young man to be imprudent and exaggerated, to live in swoops and circles, and beat about his cage like any other wild thing newly captured, as it is for old men to turn grey, or mothers to love their offspring, or heroes to die for something worthier than their lives. By way of an apologue for the aged, when they feel more than usually tempted to offer their advice, let me recommend the following little tale. A child who had been remarkably fond of toys, and in particular of lead soldiers, found himself growing to the level of acknowledged boyhood without any abatement of this childish taste. He was 13. Already he had been taunted for dallying overlong about the playbox. He had to blush if he was found among his lead soldiers. The shades of the prison house were closing about him with a vengeance. There is nothing more difficult than to put the thoughts of children into the language of their elders. But this is the effect of his meditations at this juncture. Plainly, he said, I must give up my playthings. In the meanwhile, since I am not in a position to secure myself against idle jeers. At the same time, I am sure that playthings are the very pick of life. All people give them up out of the same pusillanimous respect for those who are a little older, and if they do not return to them as soon as they can, it is only because they grow stupid and forget. I shall be wiser. I shall conform for a little to the ways of their foolish world. But so soon as I have made enough money, I shall retire and shut myself up among my playthings until the day I die. Nay, as he was passing in the train along the Estoril mountains between Cannes and Fréjus, he remarked a pretty house in an orange garden at the angle of a bay, and decided that this should be his happy valley. Astria Redu, childhood was to come again. The idea has an air of simple nobility to me. not unworthy of Cincinnatus. And yet, as the reader has probably anticipated, it is never likely to be carried into effect. There was a worm-eye, the bud, a fatal error in the premises. Childhood must pass away, and then youth, as surely as age approaches. The true wisdom is to be always seasonable, and to change with a good grace in changing circumstances. To love playthings well as a child, to lead an adventurous and honorable youth, and to settle when the time arrives into a green and smiling age, is to be a good artist in life, and deserve well of yourself and your neighbor. You need repent none of your youthful vagaries. They may have been over the score on one side, just as those of age are probably over the score on the other. But they had a point. They not only befitted your age and expressed its attitude and passions, but they had a relation to what was outside of you, and implied criticisms on the existing state of things, which you need not allow to have been undeserved, because you now see that they were partial. All error, not merely verbal, is a strong way of stating that the current truth is incomplete. The follies of youth have a basis in sound reason, just as much as the embarrassing questions put by babes and sucklings. Their most antisocial acts indicate the defects of our society. When the torrent sweeps the man against a boulder, you must expect him to scream, and you need not be surprised if the scream is sometimes a theory. Shelley, chafing at the Church of England, discovered the cure of all evils in universal atheism. Generous lads, irritated at the injustice of society, see nothing for it but the abolishment of everything and kingdom come of anarchy. Shelley was a young fool. So are these cock-sparrow revolutionaries. But it is better to be a fool than to be dead. It is better to emit a scream in the shape of a theory than to be entirely insensible to the jars and incongruities of life and take everything as it comes in a forlorn stupidity. Some people swallow the universe like a pill. They travel on through the world like smiling images pushed from behind. For God's sake, give me the young man who has the brains enough to make a fool of himself. As for the others, the irony of facts shall take it out of their hands, and make fools of them in downright earnest, ere the fast be over. There shall be such a moping and a mowing at the last day, and such blushing and confusion of countenance for all those who have been wise in their own esteem, and have not learnt the rough lessons that youth hands on to age. If we are indeed here to perfect and complete our own natures, and grow larger, stronger, and more sympathetic against some nobler career in the future, we had all best bestir ourselves to the utmost while we have the time. To equip a dull, respectable person with wings would be but to make a parody of an angel. In short, if youth is not quite right in its opinions, there is a strong probability that age is not much more so. Undying hope is co-ruler of the human bosom with infallible credulity. A man finds he has been wrong at every preceding stage of his career, only to deduce the astonishing conclusion that he is at last entirely right. Mankind, after centuries of failure, are still upon the eve of a thoroughly constitutional millennium. Since we have explored the maze so long without result, it follows, for poor human reason, that we cannot have to explore much longer. Close by must be the center, with a champagne luncheon and a piece of ornamental water. How, if there were no center at all, but just one alley after another, and the whole world a labyrinth without end or issue? I overheard the other day a scrap of conversation which I take the liberty to reproduce. "What I advance is true," said one. "But not the whole truth," answered the other. "Sir," returned the first. And it seemed to me There was a smack of Dr. Johnson in the speech. Sir, there is no such thing as the whole truth. Indeed, there is nothing so evident in life as that there are two sides to a question. History is one long illustration. The forces of nature are engaged day by day in cudgeling it into our backward intelligences. We never pause for a moment's consideration, but we admit it as an axiom. An enthusiast sways humanity exactly by disregarding this great truth and dining it into our ears that this or that question has only one possible solution. And your enthusiast is a fine, florid fellow, dominates things for a while and shakes the world out of a doze. But when once he is gone, an army of quiet and uninfluential people set to work to remind us of the other side and demolish the generous imposture. While Calvin is putting everybody exactly right in his institutes and hot-headed Knox is thundering in the pulpit, Montaigne is already looking at the other side in his library in Perigord and predicting that they will find as much to quarrel about in the Bible as they had found already in the church. Age may have one side, but assuredly youth has the other. There is nothing more certain than that both are right, except perhaps that both are wrong. Let them agree to differ, for who knows but what agreeing to differ may not be a form of agreement rather than a form of difference. I suppose it is written that anyone who sets up for a bit of a philosopher must contradict himself to his very face. For here have I fairly talked myself into thinking that we have the whole thing before us at last, that there is no answer to the mystery, except that there are as many as you please, that there is no center to the maze because, like the famous sphere, its center is everywhere, and that agreeing to differ with every ceremony of politeness is the only one undisturbed song of pure consent to which we are ever likely to lend our musical voices.